The new intellectuals are those who are willing to think, said Ayn Rand. They are those who know that man's life must be guided by reason, those who value their own life and are not willing to surrender it to the cult of despair and the rule of brutes. Today's society has degenerated into a cult of despair. It's not questionable. Even our churches are not immune. In her book For the New Intellectual, Ayn Rand gave a brilliant overview of the status of Western society, what brought us here, and how to bring a second renaissance. This book is an excellent introduction for someone wanting to understand how Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism applies to life in our society. Ayn Rand offered the book as a collection of the essential ideas in her philosophy, quote, for those who wish to acquire an integrated view of existence. Her goal was to advocate against mysticism, altruism, and collectivism, and for their opposites, reason, individualism, and capitalism. Welcome to week 1 of the New Intellectual Book Study. My name is Cody Leibold, and we are meeting as Christians interested in understanding Rand's work and finding where her insights can be valuable specifically to Christians. We're discussing Ayn Rand's book For the New Intellectual, and in the version that I have, which looks like this, we are going to be discussing starting at page 10. This is the beginning of the essay For the New Intellectual, so it's the same title for the essay and for the book. And we'll be going about 13 pages into her essay today. And then in the following week, at least in my book, I think it's the 50th anniversary book, we're going to page 37 and then to 57. If you're not sure how far that goes in your edition of the book, this first week we're reading to the point where she mentions Aquinas, and we're just dividing her title essay into 3 fairly equal segments. So this past year, for the New Christian Intellectual, our podcast has completed 2 other book studies. We spent 9 weeks discussing a new textbook of Americanism, and we've just finished a 35-week series on Objectivism and the philosophy of Ayn Rand. In those, we laid the groundwork of what philosophical ideas we believe are worth defending in a society. It's not every idea that we believe is worth defending in a society, but specifically the philosophical ideas that our societies and even our churches ought to confront, the questions that it ought to ask. And so in these book studies, we've been trying to apply Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism to what is valuable to us as Christians. Sometimes that means rejecting part of it, but a lot of times it means learning from Ayn Rand how to ask the right questions. And then we go to the Bible and look for the answers in light of some of the questions that have come up. Now, in this book study, we're going to be applying the lessons that we learned philosophically in general to the times in which we live. Ayn Rand is an able guide. She understood the role of ideas in the history of Western civilization, and she knew what to make of the ideas that now dominate in our culture. This book study is going to give you the chance to hear Rand at her most forceful and to discuss applications of her insights to the American political and cultural landscape today, 65 years after the publication of her most important work, Atlas Shrugged. Rand excelled in understanding the false ideas that have taken over in our country. We can discuss ways that in recent years, these same ideas that she discussed have seeped now into our churches and even into the movement calling itself political conservatism. So this book is going to consist of one large essay that we'll take in the first 3 weeks of discussion, and then also excerpts from Rand's novels. The excerpts are all from speeches from her characters, so this will be Rand at her least theoretical, and her most polemical, her most sweeping. This is Rand giving her ideas the form that she calculated would bring the widest reach, understanding, and long-term impact for her ideas. The accuracy of Ayn Rand's perception is hardly disputable. We are living today in a world that she described as being potentially right over the horizon during her lifetime. What can we as Christians and as Americans do about today's cultural catastrophes? In addition to prayer, I can think of 2 things. First, we can unify around a true understanding of reality. That kind of unity is what FTNCI is working to create through these book studies and through other efforts to create intellectual ammunition and to foster an exchange of true ideas. Second, we can each decide to speak up for and to vote for, to labor for, and to finance only those projects and those people that we evaluate as being worthy. That's going to mean boycotting, criticizing, and eventually abolishing corrupt institutions that are leading people astray, whether religious or secular. It also is going to mean withholding financial support and moral support from cowardly leaders, those who are trying to be in the middle, the moderates, the compromisers, the capitulators, whether those be religious or secular. It means culture war, now and perpetually, until that which is necessary has been restored, until that which is corrupt has been dismantled and replaced. So this is not a project for conventionalists, nor even for calm-minded social reformers. This is a project for passionate radicals, for those who believe in the original American Revolution, and those who labor for a new American Renaissance. So let's get started. We go in the book to the beginning. I'll look at the preface where she points out who this is for. This book is intended for those who wish to assume the responsibility of becoming the new intellectuals. That word intellectual has several different ideas to it. It can be taken in the broadest sense, those who are concerned with ideas, those who really want to think and take ideas seriously, those who want to take a philosophical outlook and who are willing to study to develop that. It can also mean those whose careers are concerned with the transmission of ideas, and that would include teachers and pastors. It would include writers, people that work in media, as well as those who actually create the new philosophies. You don't have to be a philosophical pioneer to be an intellectual, though. So, this is what we read in the preface. The full system is implicit in these excerpts, the full system of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, particularly in Galt's speech. And the purpose of this book is to help us have an integrated view of existence, at least according to Rand's philosophy. This is what an integrated view of existence requires. Now, she has often been asked this question: are you primarily a philosopher or are you primarily a novelist? And so we get into this little discussion here of the difference in how she thinks of that. Rand's view of art was that you should concretize some outlook on the world in your writing, and she did not believe that any of the philosophies that she was familiar with were her own, that they were good. So she had to actually create her own philosophy, which is extra enormous amount of work compared to what most novelists would have to do. So her answer was, I'm primarily a novelist and also a philosopher, because to her they were the same thing. She had to be a novel philosopher in order to take her worldview and put it into the works of fiction that she decided to create. So she writes, in order to define, explain, and present my concept of man, I had to become a philosopher in the specific meaning of the term. And now, 65 years later, after the publication of Atlas Shrugged, Rand is recognized as being one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century. That is something that took a long time for her to gain because her ideas are so out of the mainstream. And also because the way that she advocated her ideas was not to go through the system of academia, but rather she had a popular appeal. So that leads us into the first chapter, and this is her long essay for the new intellectual. Rand only wrote a couple of long essays like this. There's another one called Faith and Force, The Destroyers of the Modern World. These essays form the introduction to her view of history, or in this case, it's going to be her view of 3 different archetypes of different kinds of men that have lived in history. We're going to discuss these ideas of the Attila, the witch doctor, and then the men of the mind, the producers. Rand writes, when a man, a business, corporation, or an entire society is approaching bankruptcy, there's only 2 courses that he can follow, and essentially it's they can question their premises, or they can just pretend that there's no problem. Rand holds that America is facing intellectual bankruptcy. She writes, America at present is following this course, this avoiding even admitting that there's a problem. She speaks of the grayness, the stale cynicism, non-committal cautiousness, guilty evasiveness of our public voices that suggests the attitude of the courtiers in the story The Emperor's New Clothes, who professed admiration for the emperor's non-existent garments, and they've accepted the assertion that anyone who failed to perceive them was morally depraved at heart. So there's a moral problem in our leadership in American society, and this was true 65 years ago. It's more so today. America is culturally bankrupt. Rand writes, in any given period of history, a culture is to be judged by its dominant philosophy, by the prevalent trends in its intellectual life as expressed in morality, in politics and economics, in art. Professional intellectuals are the voice of a culture and are therefore its leaders, its integrators, and its bodyguards. America's intellectual leadership has collapsed. She writes, America is a a country without voice or defense, a country sold out and abandoned by her intellectual bodyguards. And I would stop there and point out just how much more so do we see that today, where the movements that call themselves constitutional conservatism are giving way to new movements such as national conservatism. A lot of what we can do as we interact with Rand's writing here is to ask ourselves, does it apply to what we observe today? If you were to look at Yoram Hazony's national conservatism movement that just had a conference of, say, 800 or 900 people in Florida, and we look at new publications coming out such as The American Reformer, which seeks to basically be integralists, but Protestant instead of Catholic. Any comments on that so far?
I think there's a sense in which we've actually turned a corner in America from the gray evasiveness of not wanting to realize that there's a problem to now I think most people would say there is a problem. And a lot of that came about from the woke movement. I think the woke movement was sort of the attempt to cash in on the fact that no one was willing to do anything about the problem. And so the leftist progressives just charged ahead as fast as they could. But as a reaction to that, now a lot on the right are saying that there's a problem, but they are misidentifying the problem and thus coming to some very terrible solutions, very similar to what Rand's going to warn against later on in this chapter.
I appreciate that. It also agrees completely with what Leonard Peikoff wrote about in the Dim Hypothesis, that the nihilism of the disintegrating movement of Obama and the radical left, that movement cannot last forever because society as a whole will protest against the lack of an integration. And so the new movement within conservatism is going to be to combat the radical left by providing a new approach to integration. And it's one that Peikoff and I would agree is a misintegration. It's let's integrate society, in this case, around social conservatism and statism. It seems to be the driving motivation of the national conservatism movement. Bankruptcy, writes Rand, is defined as the state of being at the end of one's resources. And as we've seen from the Objectivism book study, we see what that means in terms of the philosophical categories. Man's mind is impotent, reality is unknowable, man is a helpless automaton determined by social factors. Life is a sewer, writes Rand. We should love everything except for virtue, forgive everything except greatness. Our wealth should be given away to savages. And therefore, within political movements, we see the phenomenon of militant uncertainty, crusading cynicism, dogmatic agnosticism, boastful self-abasement, self-righteous depravity. Look no further than New York Times, David Brooks, or The Atlantic, or Washington Post, and look to our religious leaders who are doing the same kinds of things. Timothy Keller, Russell Moore. So now we go on. Rand writes that civilization is facing a crisis. Go ahead.
With the whining injunctions that we must love everything except virtue, and forgive everything except greatness. This immediately stood out to me because it's something I've been becoming more aware of about over the past few years. And even when I was in high school, this would have described me. I would love everything except virtue and forgive everything except greatness. I grew up Christian, and it seems as if we're taught to forgive everything and look upon virtue and greatness as, whatever. Sure, you're a good Christian, but the really hard thing is to forgive someone. Somehow, I've become more aware that the normal thing is to forgive everyone and to love everything. And there's this growing hate and disdain for greatness and virtue. And it seems as if the hard thing now is actually to know and recognize virtue and greatness and to actually love those things. And by studying Objectivism, I've learned how to do that more properly.
Well said. All right, I'll go back into the reading. So Rand is saying that civilization is facing a crisis. If we ask our intellectual leaders what are the ideals that we should be fighting for, their answer is just going to be bromides. She says brotherly love, global progress, universal prosperity at America's expense. So she's talking about, actually, at the time that she's writing, the political movement was coming out of a period of rapid expansion of the government due to the New Deal of FDR and then also World War II. Now, governments tend to expand during wars and then they contract a little bit after the wars, but they never get back to the baseline. And so we had the largest government in the United States history at the time that she's writing. And this was a time when the liberals were starting to question whether their embrace of socialism was politically viable. And they were starting to think maybe this is more of a long-range thing. But soon was going to come the war on poverty from Lyndon Johnson. And generally speaking, the presidents had a very altruistic approach to foreign policy, where they wanted to have military bases all over the world, making sure that everybody was under America's watchful eye and also receiving American aid. And so some of those things that the National Conservatives criticize as being the post-World War II liberal consensus, some of those things I would criticize as well. I don't think that the United States had business having bases all over the world and trying to be a global altruist at the expense of American taxpayers. So those are things that I would agree with. Trying to export democracy, that's always been a bad idea. You cannot export democracy because what if the people vote themselves into slavery? That a society that doesn't value liberty is not going to use democracy appropriately. So there's some concerns that the National Conservatives have with what was happening and what Rand is describing there. But the conservative movement at that time was uneasy with ideas. If you've ever listened to William F. Buckley try to describe what conservatism is, then that is the perfect picture of somebody who uses fancy verbiage, but it's all sophistry. It's all just a cover for the fact that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He just thinks that the conservatives, what does he say? They stand astride of history and they shout stop. They believe in not immanentizing the eschaton. Those are the kinds of things that he says. But these are the purported conservatives that have grown up reading Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver, the conservatives of the American Southern tradition, which means they're not an Americanist conservatives. And that's the kind of thought that took form in this mid-20th century within the conservative movement, and Rand has nothing good to say about it. She says that it's become anti-intellectual. Typically, they just have an emphasis on Cracker Barrel folksy wisdom, and that's come to dominate the conservative movement today as well, if you're familiar. So recognize the enormous power, writes Rand, and the crucial importance of the intellectual professions. She says our present state of cultural disintegration is not maintained and prolonged by intellectuals as such, but by the fact that we haven't any. The majority of those who posture as intellectuals today are frightened zombies posturing in a vacuum of their own making. That's become more and more clear. So then, Rand is going to summarize. She's going to summarize the view that we see within conservatives today and in her time. She says, reason and freedom have had their chance and have failed. And that future, like the long night of the past, belongs once more to faith and force. So faith and force, and of course she means blind faith. She means arbitrary, asserted, requiring people to follow what you say. So there is this intellectual vacuum. And the problem is that we have a society that is highly industrialized at this point. So what is the danger of having an intellectual vacuum when the humanities have no sense of direction to provide, but you have the technology to build nuclear bombs? You have the technology to run intercontinental airlines and railroads. But you have the philosophical doctrines of barefoot savages who live in mud holes. So historically, the professional intellectual, writes Rand, is a very recent phenomenon, and he dates from the Industrial Revolution. There are no professional intellectuals in primitive savage societies, only witch doctors. And she's going to start describing how in primitive societies, typically you have tribal chiefs and their witch doctors who are their allies. And they control people, but they control production. They exact taxes or gifts. And ultimately, they don't contribute a lot to production. So who are these people that are actually producing? Those that actually think, that start businesses, that are traders? At the top of 13 in my book, it says, wealth was acquired by conquest in those days, by political power, or by the favor of those who held political power. The professional businessman and professional intellectual came into existence together as brothers born of the Industrial Revolution. And she describes how, with brief exceptions, pre-capitalist societies had no place for the creative power of man's mind. Reason in its practical expression, free trade were forbidden as a sin and as a crime, or were tolerated usually as ignoble activities under the control of authorities who could revoke the tolerance at whim. Such societies were ruled by faith and its practical expression, force. So that is the story of human history. And Rand, actually, her academic work in college was in the study of history. And so, I mean, anybody that knows much about the Middle Ages or ancient times, or about the history of China or India, you could agree with Rand that this is generally the status quo throughout history. She writes that there were no makers of knowledge and no makers of wealth, there were only witch doctors and tribal chiefs. And she sees this pattern throughout different times in history. She says these two figures come to dominate every anti-rational period of history, whether one calls them the chief and the witch doctor, or later on, the absolute monarch and the religious leader, or later on, the dictator and the logical positivist, which would be his philosophical sidekick. So that's the pattern. I'm on the top of 14. The defenders of man's soul were concerned with his feelings. The defenders of man's body were concerned with his stomach, but both of them were turned against his mind. They were united against his mind. So these two figures, the man of faith and the man of force, are philosophical archetypes, says Rand. Psychological symbols and historical reality. You can see this in the conservative movement today, that this is what they're wanting. They're wanting to build this alliance between the religious leaders, suppose, like, say, Danny Akin and Albert Mohler. And then, say Albert Mohler comes and speaks at the National Conservative Conference, and he's one of the headline speakers. So there you have Marco Rubio and Albert Mohler in an alliance. Marco Rubio, the one that wants to create more of a welfare state, and Albert Mohler, the one who wants to say that it's okay as long as we're incentivizing the right moral projects, such as incentivizing families to have more kids. That's Marco Rubio and Albert Mohler. That's the Attila and the witch doctor. So Attila, the man who rules by brute force, acts on the range of the moment, is concerned with nothing but the physical reality immediately before him, respects nothing but man's muscles, and regards a fist, a club, or a gun as the only answer to any problem. So that's one type. The other type would be the witch doctor. That's the man who dreads physical reality, dreads the necessity of physical action, and escapes into his emotions, into visions of some mystic realm where his wishes enjoy a supernatural power unlimited by the absolute of nature. When I think of the witch doctors today, I think of the authors at the website Mere Orthodoxy. They have this persona of the witch doctor, this kind of person who concerns himself with ideas and loves books, very bookish, but seems in tune with abstractions, but their abstractions are not carefully mapped to historical reality. And it's those witch doctors that empower those who would want to be our slave drivers. And that's why at Mere Orthodoxy and other groups like that, American Reformer or First Things is a witch doctor publication. I could just go on and on. Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, their blog is a witch doctor publication. The Gospel Coalition
Doug
is
Wilson in his blog would be close to that.
He's a mixed case. Generally speaking, he's correct on culture war issues, and he's not openly advocating for force, right? Which is different from what the socialists do. I mean, Doug Wilson is very much more libertarian than anyone at Mere Orthodoxy. Of course, there will be overlap on some issues, and there's certainly an overlap within their fan bases, because some of Doug Wilson's strident fans are also readers of Ayn Rand, and they're readers of Mere Orthodoxy, and so you see that there would be a connection there.
Yeah, I just quickly want to say, like, there's this sense of witch doctoring that you're talking about that is obsessed with abstractions, and when you got to that layer, I immediately thought of Doug Wilson, because he's always, like, speaking in metaphors and abstractions, and it honestly annoys me, because it's hard to follow him sometimes. I do agree with a lot of what he says, but his rhetoric seems very witch doctory to me. I don't know.
He deals in slogans and bumper stickers, and I mean, he's articulate. He has the ability to write very elegantly, but he's not, by and large, operating on an intellectual level, even though most of his readers may think he does. But he's just not even operating on that level. It's actually a different level than what you see from the American Reformer or Mere Orthodoxy or First Things. Jacob, do you have anything you want to add there?
One thing that is interesting about Wilson and the post-millennial presuppositionalists is that they have a functional epistemology that is very witch doctor-y. Presuppositionalism it's a witch doctor epistemology. And they will utilize it and default to it in certain circumstances. But they also have a certain instinct, I guess, if you will, toward the earthy and the practical. And there are a lot of Christians like that today who they're split. In the realm of ideas and morality, they're more of a witch doctor. But then they will be more practical in the realm of getting things done, building a house, building a business, whatever the case might be. And they might even be a little bit of a producer. But the fact that they are split, especially the fact that the witch doctor part of the split is on the side of ideas and morality, makes it so that they are willing to partner with and cooperate and enable potential Attilas, which is really dangerous.
Thus, you have somebody like Michael Foster inviting Ayn Rand to speak on stage multiple times in multiple conferences. And Ayn Rand is an open statist. And Michael Foster, when challenged on these type of issues, or when challenged on other issues like presuppositionalism, his default answer is, well, that's no big deal. It's just ideas. To address this question of how do people come to accept mixed premises, well, to the extent that you live in reality and you work, so let's say you drive a truck, or let's say you manage a farm, you can't be that far from reality. It's only those people who live in a little apartment in New York City and write for a living that can be almost 100% living in a simulated reality without any contact with nature. And it's contact with nature tends to, like you've mentioned actually, in a previous, maybe like 9 months ago, you were telling me about how the fact that the people work naturally means that people have to have some kind of logic, appreciation of truth, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to be employed. Unless they write for a living. All right, well, let's go on. Here's what Rand says about these two archetypes, the Attila, the witch doctor. Superficially, these two may appear to be opposites, but observe what they have in common. A consciousness held down to the perceptual level of functioning. She's going to say that man's consciousness shares with animals the first two stages of its development. This is all familiar from Opar, sensations and perceptions, but it is the third state, conceptions, that makes him man. Sensations are integrated into perceptions automatically by the brain of a man or of an animal, but to integrate perceptions into conceptions by a process of abstraction is a feat that man alone has the power to perform. And he has to perform it by choice. This process of abstraction and concept formation is a process of reason, of thought. It is not automatic, nor instinctive, nor involuntary, nor infallible. Man has to initiate it, to sustain it, to bear responsibility for its results. The preconceptual level of consciousness is non-volitional. Volition begins with the first syllogism. Man has the choice to think or to evade, to maintain a state of full awareness or to drift from moment to moment in a semi-conscious daze, at the mercy of whatever associational whims the unfocused mechanism of his consciousness produces. So that's a common quality, this drifting mentally. That's a common quality in the witch doctor and in the Attila. So even though one of them is all about practical action and one dreads practical action, they both are united against the mind.
That was a summary of the first chapter of Opar.
Yes, the first two chapters. It's especially the second chapter, yeah.
Yeah, first two chapters.
And she had, of course, she hadn't written her epistemology book yet when she wrote this. But she already figured it out in essence, what it was. All right, so I'm in the middle of my page 15. Man is the only living species who has to perceive reality, which means to be conscious by choice. For animal, the question of survival is primarily physical, but for man, primarily epistemological. So she's going to characterize man's survival in the world as bringing his mind to bear on physical things. She writes, a man survives by adjusting his background to himself. If a drought strikes, then animals perish. Man builds irrigation canals. This may be familiar from your other reading. If a flood strikes them, animals perish. Man builds dams. If a carnivorous pack attacks them, animals perish. Man writes the Constitution of the United States. But one does not obtain food, safety, or freedom by instinct. And so this is the problem, is man's survival requires this, but Attila and the witch doctor are united against this feature in man, this long-ranged conceptual approach to life. So she writes, the key to both Attila and witch doctor's souls is their longing for the effortless, irresponsible, automatic consciousness of an animal. Both dread the fact that nature to be commanded must be obeyed. They dread that responsibility. They dread that autonomous human reasoning approach to life. There is only one means of survival for those who do not choose to conquer nature, and so she's going to explain, how do these men survive if they cannot conquer nature? They conquer men, of course. They conquer those who conquer nature. So Attila feels no need to understand, to explain, nor even to wonder how men manage to produce things. Somehow. That's a fully satisfactory answer. He approaches men as a beast of prey, and the consequences of his actions or the possibility of exhausting his victims never enters his consciousness. He just assumes he can get away with it indefinitely because he's not looking long range. All right, bottom of that page. Any comments before we go to the bottom of that page?
This concept of if you don't conquer nature, your only other choice is to conquer men. And my immediate thought went to pastors. Their job, you might be confused about this dichotomy if you think about pastors, because, well, don't they serve men? They don't really deal with nature, right? Well, I guess my answer to that would be, I think the nature that pastors conquer is the truth. They exist in the realm of truth and ideas and communicating the truth about God and about reality, especially. Like, those things are really one and the same when you start to properly think about these things. But the pastor's job isn't to conquer man. It's to serve man by conquering nature in the realm of ideas, truth, theology, philosophy, all these things.
And we have a problem today with pastors, to a large degree, not providing their flocks with sound teaching. They're treating their flocks as sort of like milk cows instead of the way a shepherd would tenderly take care of his people. They're seeking to build their programs. If every sermon, the call to action is, this is how you should build my church, my project. This is the programs that you should get involved in. This is how you should spend your life building my kingdom. But they're not actually loving the Bible enough to feed their people with what the Bible says about how those people can live better in their workplace, in their marriage. How those people can understand the truths about God in a way that edifies their soul. But instead, the call to action is build my program. Well, it will succeed. But it succeeds in the same way that cults succeed. It's not building Christianity at that point. So, all right, we go to the bottom of that page. A human being needs a frame of reference, a comprehensive view of existence, no matter how rudimentary. And since his consciousness is volitional, he needs a sense of being right, a moral justification for his actions, which means a philosophical code of values. How is Attila going to get that? Well, he turns to the witch doctor for that. So this is what Rand describes. She says, if Attila's method of survival is the conquest of those who conquer nature, the witch doctor's method of survival is safer, he believes, because it spares him the risks of physical conflict. He believes, and his method is just the conquest of those who conquer. Those who conquer. So there's a sort of like a hierarchy here where we've got the producers being run by the Attila, but then we have the witch doctor who ultimately runs Attila, because the witch doctor is in charge of ideology. And so he ultimately tells Attila what's right and wrong. So Rand writes, to Attila, as to the animal, the phenomena of nature are an irreducible primary. To the witch doctor, as to an animal, the irreducible primary is the automatic phenomenon of his own consciousness. That's the epistemology that we understand of the witch doctor. To the witch doctor, emotions are tools of cognition and wishes take precedence over facts. Bottom of page 17, whatever his mechanism produces is an absolute, not to be questioned, wherever it clashes with reality. It's reality that he ignores. This approach that says, well, reality be damned, my argument works. my presuppositions are true, or whatever it may be. You notice that when you look at these two characters, the Attila and the witch doctor, the Attila is half of a complete person, and the witch doctor is half of a complete person. It's one person fixated on ideas detached from reality, the other attached only to reality, but without knowing how to move in the realm of ideas. And so there's something good about each one of these, but there's something missing about each one of these. The Rand's ideal man would be a producer, somebody who is a man of the mind and a man of action, and who makes the integration correctly. So what we have here is a society of normal men and producers being ruled by broken men. That's the tragedy here. Well, there's going to be in the witch doctor's mind a clash between reality and his ideas, because he does not know how to tie. He doesn't wish to have the accountability, the autonomous human reason accountability to tie his ideas to reality. So Rand describes this clash that's going to come into his mind. A constant clash, and the witch doctor's solution is to believe that what he perceives as another higher reality where his wishes are omnipotent, where contradictions are possible, where A is non-A, where his assertions, which are false on earth, become true and acquire the status of superior truths, which he perceives by means of a special faculty denied to the other inferior beings. Mapping out what the Catholic theologians have often done is mapping out what Platonists do. We have Platonists today even. We have Christian Platonists today that speak of these higher realities in these abstract ways. The only validation of his consciousness he can obtain on earth is the belief and the obedience of others when they accept his truth as superior to their own perception of reality. If you were a pastor today, one of the ways that you would seek validation is when people listen to your sermons and they say, wow, that was really amazing. But if you don't ask yourself whether what you said was true, there's a problem. Because the validation of your flock liking it doesn't mean anything detached from reality. But you can see this is one of the problems we have in churches today. If pastors do not have a good epistemology, they're going to rely on the collective to tell them whether or not they are on track. That is not a good way to navigate. I mean, it'd be like if I was driving a car and I had one of those toy periscopes and I stuck it out the window. Except for it's even worse than that. Like, it's even less accurate to reality than that.
I want to comment on this because I think that this is actually an issue even in my own church. And I would say that it's even worse than that, because it seems like there's this idea that there's multiple groups in the congregation and they have different views about what the truth is. So the job as the pastor isn't even to preach in a way that they think that the whole congregation is going to validate what they're saying, but rather they need to preach in such an abstract way so that all the groups can agree with this void thing, this essentially meaningless thing but all the groups, although they have different views, there's this notion of, hey, look at how united we are. We are the same church, even though we disagree on all these things. And so the pastor's job is to create language that everyone agrees with, but mean different things.
So the teaching of the church then becomes whatever sounds like the gospel, but what Democrats and Republicans can agree is true. That becomes your functional definition of truth. Or at least of that truth which is worth standing for publicly.
Worse, it sounds like it's the turning of equivocation into an art and into a virtue, where you use terminology that can be understood by different groups to mean opposite things in order for them both to have the appearance of agreeing with you.
Studied ambiguity. For example, a preacher might speak of justice, and he knows that the constitutional conservatives in his church and the Democrats in his church are going to hear two totally different messages, because they have a different idea of the justice. And why would he bother explaining it? That's divisive. That's getting to the point of disputable matters or whatever. All right, let's go on. While Attila extorts their obedience by means of a club, the witch doctor obtains it by means of a much more powerful weapon. He preempts the field of morality. And thus we have people donating to the Southern Baptist Convention in order to have preachers and seminary professors teaching things they don't even believe, but they have no accountability because they think, well, God wants me to donate to this convention, right? It's God's convention. I'm at the top of my page 18. There is no way to turn morality into a weapon of enslavement except by divorcing it from man's reason and from the goals of his own existence. There is no way to degrade man's life on earth except by the lethal opposition of the moral and the practical. I mean, if you've listened to David Platt say that the core teaching of Christianity is that we must abandon ourselves. If you listen to Ed Stetzer say that mission is the abandoning of self, that doesn't sound like the missionaries of old, like Livingston. It really doesn't. They saw their own self-interest and their own joy in bringing the gospel to people. But the teaching today is this mind virus of pathological altruism. And that has come into the church, and that has taught people that they must separate reason from morality. Rand writes, there is no way to degrade man's life on earth except by the lethal opposition of the moral and the practical. Thus we have preachers of death to self. Morality is a code of values to guide man's choices and actions. When it is set to oppose his own life and mind, it makes him turn against himself and blindly act as the tool of his own destruction. There is no way to make a human being accept the role of a sacrificial animal except by destroying his self-esteem. And thus you have the emphasis in the church today that we are depraved to the point that we need to listen to what the pastor says about how we should live our lives because we're not capable of judging independently. And also pastors shouldn't be judging independently based on what they read, but they need to be doing theology in community. So what should the teaching of the church be? Well, it's whatever we can agree on. And that's exactly what Isaac was describing, where you're trying to find those points of agreement, and that's the definition of your church. It's a approach to truth that Rand described as being the social metaphysic. And that has come to dominate. So getting people to reject their own consciousness. And by the way, what better to do that than presuppositionalism? Getting people to reject autonomous human reason leads to all this. Convincing people of their impotence, in the church often by means of talking about the noetic effects of sin, in a way that doesn't comport with reality or the teaching of Scripture. As I read this paragraph, fireworks go off in my mind, thinking about all the deceptions that have been passed off as Christianity. So Rand goes on, the damnation of this earth as a realm where nothing is possible to man but pain, disaster, and defeat, a realm inferior to another higher reality, damnation of all values, enjoyment, achievement, success on earth, as a proof of depravity, the damnation of man's mind as a source of pride, damnation of reason as a limited, deceptive, unreliable, impotent faculty, incapable of perceiving the real reality as the true truth, the commandment of self-sacrifice, renunciation, suffering, obedience, humility, and faith as the good, damnation of life and the worship of death, with the promise of rewards beyond the grave. Now, I believe in those promises, but if the teaching amounts to do not seek values in the world today, then I disagree with that. So as I'm reading this, I'm reading Rand's description of what the witch doctor teaches. It's like, gasp. Like, this looks very familiar, doesn't it? This looks like what has been taught by the Gospel Coalition for the last 20 years and by all of their fans from every pulpit in America. Rand writes, the secret of the witch doctor's power lies in the fact that man does need an integrated view of life, a philosophy, whether he knows it or not. And so, if he doesn't have his own, he's going to hear the pastor preaching or the witch doctor preaching. He's going to think, well, I need that, and I feel guilty, I feel uncertain, I feel afraid. This feels true. And so that's as far as it goes. At the top of 19, Rand is going to compare the witch doctor's function of thinking, his approach to thinking, to Attila's. Attila's brain is a jumble of concretes, unintegrated by abstractions. The witch doctor's brain is a miasma of floating abstractions, unrelated to concretes. And so thus they come to need each other. The two incomplete halves of a human being. They come to need each other because Attila feels that the witch doctor can give him what he lacks, which is a long-range integrated view. And of course, Attila can provide the witch doctor with a club. Now we go to the bottom of page 19. So to them, thinking is not a means of perceiving reality. It is a means of justifying their escape from the necessity of rational perception. Reason to them is a means of defeating their victims. At FT&CI, we've often discussed how the presuppositionalists treat reason as a means only of defeating their victims. And I mean that in the sense of Christian presuppositionalists or social justice warriors, who are also Marxist presuppers. They both treat reason only as a means of defeating their victims. They treat it as a menial servant, writes Rand, charged with the task of rationalizing the metaphysical validity and power of their whims. Just as a bank robber will spend years of planning, ingenuity, and effort in order to prove to himself that he can exist without effort, so both Attila and the witch doctor will go to any length of cunning, calculation, and thought in order to demonstrate the impotence of thought. And that's the key to their motivation, is that they're trying to avoid the effort of thought. They're trying to do anything they can to set themselves up so that they never again have to engage in that effort of being responsible for your ideas and your relation to reality. Comments before I go to the next page. Alright, so thus Attila and the witch doctor form an alliance and divide their respective domains. The Attila herds the men into armies, the witch doctor sets the army's goals. Attila turns men's life on earth into a living hell. The witch doctor tells them that it could not be otherwise. Wow. As I read that, just wow. That is what the government does today to us, and that is what the church does, by and large. Making men's lives a living hell and then telling them that it could not be otherwise. It's a collaboration. So the alliance of these two rulers is precarious. And why? Well, it's because the Attila thinks that the witch doctor is mostly impractical, whereas the witch doctor considers Attila immoral. So they have a precarious alliance, but they are in alliance against someone. Who are they allied against? The men who produce. Top of page 21 in my reading. A producer is any man who works and knows what he is doing. He may function on a fully human, conceptual level of awareness only some part of the time, but to that extent he is the atlas who supports the existence of mankind. Rand goes on later, men's epistemology, or more precisely their psychoepistemology, their method of awareness, is the most fundamental standard by which they can be classified. And so Rand is going to say there's three types. There's the Attila, the witch doctor, and the producer. The man of force, the man of feelings, and the man of reason. Rand writes that the producers so far have been the forgotten men of history. With the exception of a few brief periods, the producers have not been the leaders or the term setters of men's societies, although the degree of their influence and freedom was the degree of society's welfare and progress. Most societies have been ruled by Attila and the witch doctor. And she says that the reason is not that evil wins, or that humanity is just naturally born to have such things happen. The cause is not some innate tendency to evil in human nature, but the fact that reason is a volitional faculty which man has to choose to discover, employ, and preserve. The reason why we're dominated by brutes and witch doctors is that unless men take action to identify the way that they should live, to set up things like the American Constitution, the default state is tyranny. It's just a state of default. It's the state of an unachieved human stature. Okay, we're just 2 more pages in our reading and we'll have some closing remarks. So I'm at the top of 22 now, and Rand describes that throughout history, almost every society has had this organization that you see that we've been describing here. She writes, the sound of the first human step in recorded history, the prelude to the entrance of the producer on the historical scene, was the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece. All earlier cultures had been ruled not by reason but by mysticism. I think that to a degree that is correct. I'm not sure. I wouldn't necessarily describe ancient Israel under Moses as mysticism, or under David or Solomon, during the golden age of Israel. I wouldn't necessarily say it was dominated by mysticism. That's not how I would describe Christianity, but I can see why Rand would. Or Christianity or Judaism. So, moving on to the next part. The task of philosophy, the formulation of an integrated view of man, of existence of the universe, was the monopoly of various religions that had enforced their views by the authority of a claim to supernatural knowledge, and dictated the rules that controlled men's lives. But then she describes how philosophy was born in the time of the ancient Greeks. And the reason was because just historically, in that time there was a power vacuum, and in that geographical area, it was a very mountainous region in Greece that was a high barbarian society, and there was not the ability of one ruler 500 miles away to impose power over all of these different little groups of people. And there arose politically this possibility of independent little states. And those states developed cultures, and some of those cultures developed a high appreciation of philosophy. Rand describes it as a situation, a period of time when Attila was impotent to assist the witch doctor, when a comparative degree of political freedom had undercut the power of mysticism, and for the first time man was free to face an unobstructed universe, free to declare that his mind was competent to deal with all the problems of his existence, and that reason was his only means of knowledge. And that was what we see in the philosophy of Aristotle. In this next section here, Rand describes Plato's system, which is a mystical system, two realities. And the world that we live in is illusory, semi-real. She compares it to Aristotle's philosophy. This is what she says, that Aristotle, his philosophy was the intellect's declaration of independence. Aristotle, the father of logic, should be given the title of the world's first intellectual in the purest and noblest sense of the word. And she goes on to describe how in his approach to making inductive generalizations about nature, and then his approach to logic and non-contradiction, he was an intellectual titan. And she writes that if we consider the fact that every day, everything that makes us civilized beings, every rational value that we possess, including the birth of science, the Industrial Revolution, the creation of the United States, even the structure of our language, is the result of Aristotle's influence, of the degree to which explicitly or implicitly men accepted his epistemological principles, we would have to say, never have so many owed so much to one man. Well, I would compare Aristotle to other important people in human history, such as Jesus Christ. I'd compare him to Moses, to Abraham. It's not a fair comparison, though, because one of them is making contributions to science and to epistemology, and the others are making contributions to understanding of God and sin. So I wouldn't even call it a real comparison. But yes, society and human flourishing depends on the work of Aristotle, or at least depends on those ideas, doesn't it? So, wrapping up this section of the reading, and this will be our close. Attila regained his power with the rise of statism in the Roman Empire. If you're familiar with the Roman Empire, it moved from being a republic eventually to being a dictatorship. And what followed was the fall of Rome, as a drained hulk, bankrupt in spirit and body, unable to muster any power of resistance to the invasion of barbarian hordes, and then the looting and the devastation of Europe by the literal Attila, and the centuries of brute violence, bloody tribal warfare, of unrecorded chaos known as the Dark Ages. The witch doctors, in this case the Catholic Church, the popes, were re-emerging with a new version of mysticism. Now, those were going to become important. There was, in the Middle Ages, just as Rand has been describing, there was this truce between the witch doctors and the Attilas. In this case, now it's the feudal lords. But they're all unified by the Catholic Church, Christendom. And I agree with her assessment here. The Middle Ages, she writes, was a period ruled by the witch doctor in a firm, if mutually jealous, alliance with the Attila. And in those times, they had the power to excommunicate, which would have been the worst thing that you could do to somebody in Christendom. Or they had the power to burn at the stake. So Rand writes, philosophy in that era existed as the handmaiden of theology, and the dominant influence was appropriately Plato's, in the form of Plotinus and Augustine. Aristotle's works were lost to the scholars of Europe for centuries, and the prelude to the Renaissance was the return of Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas. And that's where we wrap up our reading. The story that she's telling there of the Middle Ages, I think, is accurate. There's more that could be said about the benefits of Christianity in those times, but to the extent that faith and force, blind faith, and arbitrary force, ruled Europe, we did have a dark period in human history. So that is what is wrong with the Middle Ages, and I've thought about this national conservative movement under Yoram Hazony, and I thought, gosh, are they not medievalists? It's hard to say what their goals are. I think they're not quite unified around what their goals are. But if you were to look at their statement of principles, they don't believe in states' rights. They don't believe in the Constitution. They believe in some form of central power that's going to enforce their version of traditional values, and they want to enforce it vigorously. It's understandable why they are concerned about the direction of society and why they're concerned that democracy has gone off the rails and that it requires some kind of centralized solution. But the concern that Jacob and I have, and I think the concern that Michael O'Fallon has about this movement, is that they are anti-constitutional, that they are rejecting those good things within the American form of government. They're rejecting the checks and balances that we have set up within our system. And that's going to lead to eventually reestablishment of this Attila and witch doctor relationship between the church and the state. And it's going to lead to the state taking a much more dominant place in our lives, even than it does today. And we ought to be going the exact opposite direction. We ought to be going back toward the state having less dominance in our lives. And we can discuss that as time goes on. We can discuss their statement. I've looked through their statement and found every single 14 different points that I disagree with on their statement of principles. And this is probably part of the project, is to interact with that view. And, over time we could be discussing the relationship of what we've read here to the theonomists, or the relationship to different theories of government that we see in discussion today. Especially what I see at the American Reformer, I think would be worth engaging with. There are some other points of connection that I wanted to make. There's, if you're familiar with Leonard Peikoff's essay, The Duel Between Plato and Aristotle, what Rand is discussing here is very similar to that. It's the very last thing that we read in the Opar book study. So that's a good point of comparison. And also, as you're studying this essay, consider looking at Faith and Force, The Destroyers of the Modern World. That's by Ayn Rand. It's available online. Also consider looking at her essay, Conservatism and Obituary. That has been fairly influential in my understanding of the conservative movement. I want to bring in just a little bit from that right now. Rand asks, what are the conservatives? What are they seeking to conserve? It is generally understood that those who support the, quote, conservatives expect them to uphold the system which has been camouflaged by the loose term of the American way of life. Is that not the kind of rhetoric that we hear today? The American way of life, but they don't want to describe it. Why not? Well, this was 65 years ago, or even longer, maybe 70 years ago she wrote this. She says that they just believe in, quote, the American way of life. The moral treason that the, quote, conservative leaders have committed lies in the fact that they are hiding behind that camouflage. They do not have the courage to admit that the American way of life was capitalism. And that's what the national conservative movement has abandoned, is allegiance to the idea of laissez-faire capitalism. They don't like that. They think that fusionism between social conservatism and capitalism is a horrible idea. And it's out with the capitalism, in with only the social conservative statist vision. So this is the groundwork for where we are today. Those decades ago, they were hiding behind the fact that they did not want to recognize that the American way of life is capitalism. That was the political economic system born and established in the United States. The system which in one brief century achieved a level of freedom, progress, and prosperity of human happiness unmatched in all the other systems in centuries combined. And that is the system which they are now allowing to perish by silent default. If the conservatives do not stand for capitalism, says Rand, they stand for and are nothing. They have no goal, no direction, no political principles, no social ideals, no intellectual values, no leadership to offer anyone. Yet capitalism is what the, quote, conservatives dare not advocate or defend. They are paralyzed by the profound conflict between capitalism and the moral code which dominates our culture, the morality of altruism. Capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They are philosophical opposites, and they cannot coexist in the same man or the same society. That conservative movement, it was incoherent in 1960 when Rand wrote those words. But the movement that is now called national conservatism is even worse than what she was describing. I mean, their explicit platform is anti-constitutional. If you read it point by point, you read things from them, I mean, like Rod Dreher explicitly saying that he wants to be like the New Deal Democrats. If that's what your movement of conservatism is, then it's not American, and it's not virtuous. Well, Let me wrap up by saying the troubling ideological direction of American society and churches can indeed be summed up in the terms that Ayn Rand offered. She gave us 3 terms to describe it: mysticism, altruism, collectivism. And what is the alternative to those 3 things? It's the values that are found only in sound philosophy, and those are reason, individualism, capitalism. If you look at the homepage at our website at christianintellectual.com, you'll see what we stand for. It says, become a Christian defender of reason, individualism, and capitalism, those 3 values that Rand upheld. If we're going to unify around a true understanding of reality, these need to be the terms of the discussion. Well, thank you for joining us for this session of the New Intellectual Book Study. Please leave a like, give this a share, and find the schedule of our upcoming meetings at christianintellectual.com/intellectual. I look forward to talking with you soon. God bless.